panel. It's a discussion of where will Western commitments in the Middle East and North Africa lead to. And we have a really distinguished panel. I'm not going to go into lengthy introductions because they're in your book, but we have the former president of Latvia, Vashadze, with us. We have Dr. Fraser Cameron, who is a senior advisor at the European Policy Center and also the new
EU Asia Center.
New director of the EU Asia Center. I thought also North Africa. And North Africa. We have Anas El-Gamati, who's a Libyan political analyst. Ambassador Kurt Volker, who's a managing director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins. And Ambassador Hussein Duryosh, the Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning at NATO. And what we're going to try to do is get to the audience as soon as possible with questions. But we'll start with a few opening statements. So I'll start with you, President Zadlers. What did we learn from the NATO involvement in Libya and North Africa, and what does it mean to the future?
Usually we have to start with lessons learned and experience got. So I think the first lesson learned that the crisis come up in an unpredictable way, and take us by surprise. And even if you have some financial problems around the world, and especially in Europe, you have to tackle the crisis that comes up really very close to our borders, and with the situations and processes that really change not only the region, definitely the Northern Africa, but as well influences the Europe, the North Atlantic Organization, and as well as the globe as a whole. So there were a lot of concerns about are we prepared, and could the Europe lead the operation? And what we learned that despite these concerns, Europe was ready. And especially France and Great Britain took the leading role while America was hesitating. And it also changed our perception who might be the leaders in the NATO. You see, it's according to the place we need our force. And the military did well. Experience also what we got is that Afghanistan is not the last operation outside the borders of NATO. So a lot of lessons, and I think this discussion will lead to more detailed analysis what we have to do in the future. But definitely we have to also change something in our strategies and as well as our planning because we have to be well prepared also for the next crisis, which will happen, we don't know where, but somewhere in the globe. Because the NATO and Europe definitely has to play its role on really enabling the stability all over the globe. It's not only the Europe's area, it's not only the area around the Europe.
Okay. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. El-Gamati. Do the people in the region, I mean, you're a Libyan political analyst, do the people in the region want the West to be there? What do you think is the appropriate role for the West to be playing in your part of the world?
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for having me here. I think when we look at the region as a whole, we must assess the background of how relations were built. And clearly, when we look at the exercises and endeavors of democracy bringing to the Middle East and, say, Iraq, we can see a way of not how to bring democracy there. When we look at Libya and the case for intervention in Libya, I think there shows a clear sign of support, clearly from the people in Benghazi. After the no-fly zone was enacted, there were signs or scenes of euphoria at the hands, at least, of Western people coming into Libya. I mean, I don't want to say it's a grand invasion, but any action that's coming in, positive action as such, is clearly welcomed. And I think it's not just about Libya. If we want to talk about the West being involved in the region, ask the Syrian people whether they would like a no-fly zone. I think that might, it may herald a very, very similar answer. These are clearly issues that we have to now assess as we enter the 21st century and as we move on. Really, if we look at the relations between the Arab region, Muslim world, and the West, I think we can quite clearly draw them down three separate lines. First and foremost, they were based on security in the, against violent extremism, terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, the like of the buzzwords that, whether they influence academic spheres or even the media. Two, we look at stability, which has unfortunately encroached upon the very rights that are now being fought for in Libya, Egypt, Tunis, Syria as well, and other countries in the Arab Spring. And third, obviously, they were predicated on the question of Israel, which is a clearly very pertinent issue and will be central to themes on discussion of the Arab Spring. If these three themes are central and key towards understanding relations, and these are themes that were predicated on old relationships between autocracies and the demagogues which were in charge of these countries, then clearly we need a reassessment, and it's just as much about the people in the Arab world as it is about people in the West. If anything, it was a realignment and a shuffling of trying to grasp higher moral values, and that's what the people of the Middle East were doing. And if we look at the emergence of a discourse such as Samuel Huntington's on the clash of civilizations, we can now see quite clearly that conflict and ideas on conflict are completely scrapped if we try to assess them with old frameworks. I think what we need now is a fresh perspective, and perhaps looking forward to perhaps ideas of security, as we can see Islamic fundamentalism, or what it's become to known as in the West, is now a facade. It really is not, what the indigenous peoples of the Middle East seem to find a popular form of expression, and it really is like a fish that only swims in certain waters. If you assess the jihadist movement, it requires certain things. It requires strong marginalization, the encroachment of fundamental rights, fundamental liberties such as the liberty of expression, the liberty of assembly. Just the very fact that we can gather like this now is not something that we would patronize in the Middle East. These are fundamental rights, liberties, and values that not only did the people of the Middle East want, and would further question anybody in the world, whether secular or religious, who wouldn't want those freedoms. So we have to move forward to understand these were the themes from before. Do we now have a fresh perspective on how to move forward?
Great. Ambassador Dariush, I'm tempted to ask if NATO is ready to go to Syria now, but I'm not going to put you on the spot.
Thank you for that.
What, unless you want to. What are the lessons that you take away from what's happened in the last months in North Africa?
Well, first let me thank you and the organizers for inviting me to this conference, and it's a pleasure and honor to address such a distinguished groups, and my thanks also go to the Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry and the Latvian Transatlantic Association. Now, what have we learned and from what's happening in North Africa and in the Middle East at large? Well, first of all, I would say the situation that we have encountered there creates both challenges and opportunities, both for the international community and for NATO. And this happens at a time when we are constrained by difficult economic pressures on our overall budgets, but in particular the defense budgets. So we have to be more efficient with the limited resources we have at our disposal. starting from this generalism, I would say that from NATO's perspective, what the crisis has shown is that NATO and the international community should be ready and capable to act when they are called upon. And in particular, the Operation Unified Protector that was led by NATO in response to the United Nations Security Council resolution has shown that NATO is still an indispensable alliance. So that's another fundamental conclusion that we draw. It has the military capability and the political will to contribute to international security, and not only alone, but together with its partners, in particular its operational partners. Indeed, this operation has saved countless of lives, and NATO is committed to help and protect the Libyan people and continue the Operation Unified Protector as long as it is necessary to protect the civilians. Another lesson or conclusion that can be drawn is that European countries can indeed lead complex military operations. Of course, it has also at the same time underlined the limits of European capabilities to some extent, but European countries with Canada undertook the lead of the mission in Libya, and they couldn't do so if they were not supported by specific US capabilities. So this also shows that another lesson or conclusion, it has revealed that there's a fundamental challenge, the spending gap between European allies, European countries, and the United States. But this is not only a transatlantic issue, this imbalance of burden sharing. It also exists within Europe, among European allies and among European countries. So it's not just a transatlantic issue, or a US-European issue, but it's a large gap between more capable and willing European countries and other European countries as well. And I would say, of course, perhaps I can address this aspect, what to do about it in the discussion period, but I'll just briefly mention that what we and our Secretary General and NATO is proposing to come up with as a remedy for redressing the imbalance both across Atlantic but also within Europe on burden sharing and declining defense budgets is what we term as smart defense. Of course, in the European Union, this is called pooling and sharing, and they have to be coordinated and deconflicted. But smart defense implying we have to have similar priorities, prioritization, common prioritization, but most importantly, there should be multinational approaches to capability development. So that would be an important lesson and remedy to overcome the lessons learned from this imbalance in the light of what's happening. And for the future commitments of NATO into Middle East and North Africa, what's happening, of course, there NATO would be prepared to be in a supportive role, in particular if it is called upon, and in areas where it has expertise, like, for example, defense and security reform, and we already have programs like Mediterranean Dialogue, Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. These can be utilized, or other programs that can be built around these tools that we have can be used to contribute to the reforms in the Mediterranean basin, but one important precondition being that the requests will be coming from the countries concerned. So local ownership is paramount. Thank you.
Fraser, that was a fairly, I'd say, carefully nuanced presentation of how to respond in the future. Is that enough, or is that appropriate given the state of Europe and the United States right now? Should we be more ambitious, or does that seem to be about right?
We should be more ambitious, definitely. Will we be more ambitious? Certainly not, because of the current financial and economic crisis. I think this latest escapade with Libya showed exactly where we are in terms of European security and in transatlantic security. First point to emphasize, we wouldn't be there without the French philosopher. So nobody should underestimate the power of the pen here. And it was interesting that I was in Egypt last week, and what our colleague here from Libya said is so true. We have completely misread the situation in the Middle East in terms of failing to understand what the street wants. It's not a clash between Muslim fundamentalism or autocracy. It's about dignity. It's about young people wanting jobs, them now being able to communicate with each other. And I think we've absolutely failed in Europe and America to understand that. So we have to, I think, in future, try and do more thinking out of the box. As you said, Mr. President, we are never going to be prepared for the crisis. The crisis always comes unexpectedly. But I think what we've seen is that you need political leadership here. And we had it belatedly from Paris and London, essentially for domestic reasons. And I think from Washington, we saw what will also happen in future, that regardless of which administration is in power, the Americans are going to take a step back when it's an issue involving essentially the Europeans and say, it's your neighborhood, get on with it and deal with it. So what does this mean for Europe? We have to do far more in terms of cooperation and sharing, which everyone here would subscribe to, and our 5 prime ministers already said that, but it's incredibly difficult to do it in terms of national politics. And if anyone has the answer how to do this, they will get a Nobel Peace Prize. The other final point I would make is the attitude of Germany. Germany used to be sort of berechenbar, as Horst Teltschik will remind us too. Germany is no longer berechenbar in terms of its position in security policy, and I think that's a very significant change, and we have to work through how to deal with that. At the moment, there are only 2 powers prepared to take the leadership in Europe, and that's Britain and France, and that's under carefully defined circumstances. And for the foreseeable future, I think that will remain the case.
Kurt, you wrote a piece not so long ago that I happen to like, but some people found it a little cranky, where you were fairly critical of NATO, of the Western intervention in Libya. I don't want you to rehash the article, but what are the lessons that you take out of this? Because I think they're somewhat different than what we've heard so far.
Right, and let me first clarify what you mean by that. I was critical not of the intervention, just that we didn't do it well enough, and that we should have we shouldn't be concluding now that because we've succeeded in helping the Libyan rebels, that everything is fine with NATO. We still have a lot of work to do. So that was the point of that. Now, in terms of what to take away, first I want to emphasize what our Libyan colleague here said. This really is about fundamental values that we in our transatlantic community understand in our own societies. And we have been hypocritical in the way we've looked at others in the world. And it's very much a point you made as well. We listened to the dictators who told us that it's either us or the extremists. And that's certainly not the case. There's a vast majority of people in the middle who are looking for freedom and rights and justice in their own societies, and that's where we need to align ourselves. Another conclusion that I draw from this, I get very disturbed when I hear people talk about there being a conflict between our interests and our values. And they say, well, of course we do believe in democracy, but, and then you have the security arrangements, you have Israel, you have the basing arrangements, you have containment of Iran, you have the nuclear proliferation issues. But I think this is completely backwards. I think that if you look at the history of the last 40 to 50 years, think about the number of problems that have arisen as a result of the dysfunctionality within the Middle East from these regimes that have been imposed on people. And we would continue to suffer from that onward out if that didn't change. So our long-term interests are to see free societies, more democratic societies, more fair, just societies, stronger economies where people can really participate in their own livelihood and their own future, that's going to assure our interests far better than relying on dictators in a region. So in the long term, our values and our interests absolutely align. The problem we have is not that they're in conflict. The problem is a short-term, long-term problem. How do we get from here to there and manage our interests over this period of time and truly end up in a better place with people in the region?
So we're going to turn it over to the audience in just a second. So if you've got a question, get prepared. I see quite a few of them. Let me just ask all of you this, though. How do you respond to an issue like Syria? I mean, you could argue that all of the atrocities that prompted an intervention in Libya are happening there in at least equal intensity, that you've got an equally brutal regime with all of the complexities. What should we do there? President?
We can't compare Libya to Syria. It's a totally different story. And as well as on which system or organization the dictatorship is based on. Maybe I'm one of few people in this audience who had the opportunity to talk about 2 hours to President Assad. So, and when these events in Syria started, I was not surprised. I really was not surprised. Because if he is talking to the West, he has always been like a reformer, and the reforms never came. And I have the answer why, because basically it's based on one party, strong party military organization all over the country. It's Ba'ath Party, and we have similarities in the Soviet Union of Communist Party and military and KGB, and we have the similarities in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. And that's a difference because this country, Syria, is really ruled by very organized force. It's not Gaddafi, who was not just a big brother of the nation and with no institutions. We don't understand how this tribal system worked. But Syria is a very tough case. And if you remember, when Assad was invited by Sarkozy to the Mediterranean meeting, everybody was concerned about that. Some people were saying that that's a mistake, because this is a dictator. Some people were enthusiastic and say, okay, let's pull this man to the reforms. And it ended up that Assad became enthusiastic himself. He went to Iran, with no success, and then the game is over. It's not just Assad, it's the system which is really very, very tough and strong and anti-democratic in Syria. So it's much more difficult case than any other Arab country.
Fraser, do you agree?
To some extent. I mean, the circumstances are different. With Libya, with the Arab League support, with the UN Security Council, at least Russia and China abstaining, and we had a greater consensus that something had to be done. That doesn't exist with regard to Syria, and so we've come back, the fallback position is always sanctions. And I think the EU has gone as far as it could at its last council meeting to agree sanctions. Unfortunately, the serious ones are being delayed for a couple of months because of business interests. But I think there's no consensus at the moment to go beyond what we have done. I personally would like to see it, but I just don't see the political will to do it.
Mr. El-Ghamadi?
From experience with the Libyan regime, from friends based all over the world that hail from Syria, their experience in dictatorship was no less violent than ours prior to the Arab Spring. Now, it feels like, and it will always be a gut feeling, but if we follow the logical, if we follow the logic of Assad, in the same way that we follow the logic of Gaddafi, then it's only a matter of time before the people of Syria will turn this into an armed conflict on their own. So it's not about solutions or about discussing solutions, but it's almost like a ticking bomb. I saw what happened in Benghazi. I saw the streets of Tripoli lined with AK-47s and heavy machinery. It's not a pretty sight. It's not a sight to want to see a baker or a geography teacher have to hold an AK-47, or even worse than this, to see a father have to bury his own son. This is now a situation that is not only occurring in Syria, but we're just one step away from it being armed. So, I mean, yes, whilst there are certain details and certain fundamentals that are different in each case, perhaps the sectarian divisions that exist and the religious divisions that exist in Syria are not shared by Libya. In terms of violence, we're approaching something perhaps even worse than Libya. So I personally feel that, you know, we have to take a stronger approach. I think, again, it comes back to the ideas of sharing values, which is what I personally hope the 21st century will be about, and not about economic interests, which will determine international relations and interventionism, similar to what, you know, Fraser said about going back to a fallback position on sanctions. It's clearly not enough. I think we have to move forward, and a serious discussion on Syria would need to take place for that.
Kurt, if there's a civil war in Syria, do we take sides?
We ought to. We definitely ought to. Sanctions is what you do when you don't know what else to do, but you want to look like you're doing something. And so that's where we are. I'm absolutely in the camp of our Libyan colleague here, and let me put it this way. We have been slow every step of the way as the Arab Spring has progressed throughout this region. We were slow to understand what happened in Tunisia. When the Egyptian people began protesting, we sent Frank Wisner to Cairo to say Mubarak's part of the solution. We then backtracked on that and got that one right, and then we were surprised when it happened in Libya. And when Gaddafi's using aircraft against his own people, we don't do anything. And then we finally put in place a no-fly zone when that's already stopped. And so we didn't arm and train the Libyan rebels for months, thinking that the protecting civilians no-fly mission was going to work. You obviously need something on the ground, and as you said, it's a monopoly of force when you have a regime that has a military and intelligence services, and police forces, and average citizens. So they're going to need some help. And in the case of Syria, again, it surprises me that we are continually surprised. Because here it is again, you have people demanding basic rights and a regime willing to crack down that has a monopoly of force. I think he felt that he could do that in part because we were hesitant on Libya. And he knew that he's got a harder nut to crack than Libya, which is true. But I do think we should be much more assertive in seeking an outcome in Syria that's going to be respectful of the rights of people. And also, I would say, in sending a signal to our other friends in the region. We didn't create this Arab Spring, this demand for greater rights and liberties. This is coming out of the people themselves. Neither can we stop it. It's going to happen. And so countries are going to have to decide how they handle it, and we would hope that it would all be handled as peacefully and as transformationally as possible with all of the countries in the region. You don't need to have regime change in order to change policies and governance.
Yaşar, did you want to comment on this? Or you're in a little different situation, so I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, I can just say not under my NATO hat, but under my hat as the former ambassador in Jordan. Perhaps I would only I agree with Mr. Volker also on what he has said on this. Just one point that, of course, paramount thing for us is our values, and we have to support in the direction of our values, the democratic aspirations. That's given, and that's clear. At the same time, how to reconcile that without being seen to be imposing on a model to the countries concerned. So how to reconcile that two will be one of the challenges, and there, of course, regional support, regional ownership, and clear mandate are important kind of preconditions to my of intervention. But pressure, I would say personally, yes, I mean the direction is clear, but how to go about it is complicated because, as it was stated, there are similarities between different cases, but equally there are differences. Yeah. Sectorial outlook is different, the role of the armed forces is different, therefore the potential for violence can vary from nation to nation. So it will be a complicated issue, but on the other hand, we have to have clarity of mind on the direction for supporting the democratic aspirations and our values. Thank you.
We're going to go to questions. We have mics, right? someplace? Right there. So we're going to start down here. Will you please identify yourself and keep your question a question and not a comment?
Yeah. Two technical questions.
Who are you?
Dr. Sadiq, I'm from Cairo, Egypt.
Okay.
I was following the NATO operations from the beginning, and I have two questions. Some are raised by me and some raised by public opinion in the Middle East. Number one, the media are also very important, and we don't know why the operations of NATO did not target from the beginning the state-run TV station that was used by Gaddafi to mobilize and keep on. It did not stop until the guerrilla, finally liberated Tripoli. So I don't know if you have technical problem on that. Secondly, there was a lot of criticism. Why NATO took such a long time in a country like Libya? If this is a small army and tribes, and it took you that months, so many months. Is that the strongest military force in the world? It took so long, and so they built on that the conspiracy theory. Maybe NATO wants to destroy the country so that the European companies would come and have business. Thank you.
Who wants to answer that one?
Yes. Actually, the first part of the question, I didn't fully get, but I'll answer the second part, if I may. Why did it take so long? First of all, we have to make a distinction between the decision-taking part, where decision-making in NATO was quite speedy compared to the decision-taking in the case of Kosovo. It took 6 months. In the case of Libya, it took 6 days. Therefore, it was quite speedy. Why did the operation take so long? Well, of course, the operation took long, but not with the aim of to let the country be destroyed and therefore find a share for businesses in the aftermath. No, definitely not. On the contrary, because the mandate included no boots on the ground, so on the first place, because there was no land operation, it was one of the causes of the slowness. And another one is the whole idea was to protect the civilians. So while trying to protect the civilians, you should be very and extremely careful in not having collateral damage. And this was one of the military operations where damage to civilians was the smallest, and it was very carefully operated and very well, it was very successful in achieving that objective. Therefore, and because of the tactics by the regime forces, mixing in between in civilian population, etc., made this task very difficult. So that explains the slowness. But I wouldn't say in the overall, in the long-term perspective, when we look at it, it will be, I hope, evaluated as an efficient and prompt response.
Anybody else, Kurt?
Well, as you know, I have a very different view, and so I'll share that. I have the luxury of speaking for myself rather than for any government or for NATO. But I was at NATO during the Kosovo era campaign, and I think it's a miscomparison to say it took a long time in Kosovo and a short time in the case of Libya. Once we knew what we wanted to do, it doesn't take long to agree. And in the case of Kosovo, there was a lot of hesitancy about doing anything. No one wanted to intervene. In the case of Libya, there was a very quick upwelling of desire to intervene because of the impending humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi. So I don't see much difference there. But when you come to the operation itself, I think, I did write this article and I'll give you a copy later, but from the mission, the leadership, the capabilities, and the solidarity, we have work to do at NATO. The mission, as you said, and you're correct, protect civilians. That is not a serious mission when you're dealing with a dictator who has all the force on his side. And so we are unwilling to target the forces and the infrastructure and the leadership of Gaddafi for several months until it became untenable to have this stalemate continue. So we had to break through that, but that was several months of delay. Secondly, on the capabilities, the European nations needed the backbone of the U.S. capabilities. The U.S. had wanted to hand off to the European allies, couldn't really do that, and we also went through that period. You asked, and I should also say, in Afghanistan, we made a big point about asking every ally to do what it could, and every ally to be present on the ground in Afghanistan. And Latvia is a great example of a small country that nonetheless found ways it could contribute in Afghanistan. In the case of Libya, I think we had about 8 or 9 of NATO countries taking part. Some did not because they didn't have relevant capabilities, which is its own problem, and some didn't because they weren't comfortable even with taking part in a military mission. This is a real problem for an alliance, frankly, in my view. And I think we need, and the United States in this case, unfortunately, I think by pulling A-10s out of the mission, by not providing UAVs earlier when we could have done, by not taking part in some of the other aspects for some time, until the very last couple weeks of the mission, I think that this also sets a precedent for picking and choosing, which I think is dangerous for an alliance as well. So I think there are a lot of problems that NATO has to overcome. Your specific point about oil companies, though, and destroying things, I don't accept that at all. In fact, I think if we had acted as I'm advocating, harder and faster and with more strategic determination, there may have been more damage, but it would have been over faster, and I would argue with fewer casualties than the Libyan people suffered.
Okay. Question over here, and then we'll take one from over on this side, right there. Go ahead.
Markus Keim, SWP Berlin. I would like to follow exactly the last remark about the future of NATO. What does it mean in Libya? I mean, we have to keep in mind in Afghanistan, the paradigm was together in, together out. Libya, obviously, the paradigm was some go in, some others don't. And what does it mean? You already mentioned the point. I mean, in terms of capabilities and financial constraints, the situation won't go away. There are budgetary constraints will be a burden for European budgets for the next couple of years. And at the same time, there's a declining interest or declining appetite to get involved in expeditionary missions, unlike the 1990s. We have seen that there are limited results. The possibilities of external intervention is very limited. What is your concrete expectation? In which direction is NATO going to develop? A platform for loose cooperation, for political decision making and getting legitimacy or legal United Nations mandate? And what does it mean at the end of the day on functional erosion of NATO?
Who wants to take that one? President?
It's a very difficult question, you know. I don't think that we are talking about the erosion of NATO. Just vice versa. Now, after this operation, we see that the military might of NATO is a very effective one. And you see, even in this audience, you make the same mistake. We are really focusing only on military results. And we are really claiming that's too long operation, you know, too many casualties. But in fact, it was a short operation with minimum casualties on both sides, on military and both on civilian. We are not talking about how long the political solution will take place. And we did the same mistake in Afghanistan. We started to talk about that about nearly 3, 4, 5 years afterwards, and now still much progress in that direction. So in Northern Africa, we really see that we have to focus on political solutions. We're not talking about only military success. NATO is a tool for achieving quick military success. What's the next step? That's a more important question. So NATO is functioning well.
Professor Cameron, do you think that the EU and the United States are going to rush in now to North Africa and provide the kind of support that they need to build a new political system?
No. First of all, they don't have the, well, they have the resources, but have the political will to put the resources there? And the answer is no. The EU's come out with a sort of new upbeat version of the neighborhood policy, which is a little bit more money, emphasizing conditionality, potentially a European endowment fund and so on. But if you talk to the people in the region, they say it's peanuts. I mean, it's not exactly peanuts, but it's not, in terms of the magnitude of the situation, enough to tackle the problems like the budget deficit that is obviously going to come in Egypt pretty soon. So there's a lot of nice talk. There's a lot of willingness to engage, to listen. I mean, Cathy Ashton's been there half a dozen times in the last few months. But we're also tarnished by our previous association by dealing with Mubarak and the others. So when we start coming and preaching democracy, human rights. They say double standards. Who were you talking to for the last 25 years? And that is a serious handicap in terms of the Europeans or the Americans coming and trying to preach democracy and human rights. So should we be doing more? Absolutely. Are we ready to do more under the present political circumstances on either side of the Atlantic? No, we're not.
Will you take their money even if it's a double standard?
Well, not in Libya, we've got oil, so thank you very much. So what I'm saying, I think essentially countries like Egypt and Tunis on a Monday woke up with Mubarak and Ben Ali, poor, no dignity. On a Tuesday woke up without them, with dignity, but will still be poor countries. They still need aid. However, to reassess, should this aid now be conditional? Yes. I think yes, I mean, these countries should take their money. I mean, if you're a poor person, would you say no? Of course not. No. However, on the basis of conditionality, I mean, this aid should be given, or should have been given to Mubarak on the condition of political and judicial reform. As we look now to post-revolution Tunis and Egypt, where sincere and very strong reforms need to be in place because the state has not eroded, rather the head of state has left. The aid that's given to these countries now needs to be given on the condition of, well, are you reforming? You know, on clear political and legal frameworks with assessment there. There should be civil society groups, should be, you know, they should be spoken to, they should be engaged with. Initiatives from America, I mean, it's not just about aid in the financial sense. I mean, there are some strong, or great groups, in fact, from the Western world, which can, in fact, add value in the region. To lead from the front, I think, would, as Fraser said, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you jump in and you start preaching democracy, I think people will walk away. But to engage, and fundamentally to engage along the spectrum, along all areas of the spectrum, we can no longer, in the region, we can no longer try and say who is acceptable, who is not acceptable. This means secular groups and, in the popular debate, Islamist groups as well. They must be engaged with. And we've learned vitally in the region, Palestine learned the hard lesson of democracy, having elected Hamas, who did not fit the criteria of the Europeans. Fundamentally, it was the expense of the people themselves. They lived under a siege, lives were lost purely because of a political decision. And they were asked to play the game of democracy. So we really have to, again, as I said earlier, the Arab Spring is as much about the people within the Arab world as it is with those on the outside. How do we determine what aid is given, like I've already said, but fundamentally there are further ways of bringing democracy in, and when I say bring, they already have it now, or they're trying to bring it themselves, but to aid in this struggle is something that we need to do together, especially as the world talks more on cooperation.
Next question up here. Then over here, the sophisticated man with the bow tie.
Thanks very much. Iman Sliagis, member of the Latvian Parliament. This is an important session because it's focusing on a region that is not close in many ways to this region, and so we're looking at a global issue, and in the last session we touched on the importance of Nordic Baltic cooperation. So my question really is, and it's he won't be surprised about this, it's aimed at Kurt Volker, but I'd welcome comments from other panelists, is what do you feel that, that the Nordic Baltic region can in particular offer to the Middle East and North Africa? You know, what are the specific areas that we can perhaps offer to them that would be of use, and which would also give an added profile to the region within NATO and the European Union? Thank you.
Bert?
Well, Imants and I rehearsed this last week, and he was sitting here and I was sitting there at another panel. But if I could add a couple of thoughts, both in Imants' question and then coming back to our German colleague question as well. But in terms of the Nordic Baltic region, what is characteristic about this? One of them is that they are well-functioning societies, they are reasonably prosperous, they are members of the EU and NATO, they are very well embedded with each other, so they're learning how to make good out of small, and they have tremendous intellectual capital in the region. Those are all great assets, and when you think about, well, what could that do? First off, you can help shape better NATO and EU policies by working together as a region to bring ideas forward and work together with the Germans, French, British, Italians, others, to try to really contribute to the formulation of the most coherent and useful EU and NATO policies. I think that's one very significant area. Another is to look at areas of technical assistance that are welcomed and needed by the people in the region where you can bring some particular expertise. And I'll throw off a couple that you look at a transition country like Libya, which has had a Gaddafi law for 40 years instead of what we would consider a normal rule of law. Education, where you've had the Green Book instead of normal education. The economy, where it's run by a few, like also in Egypt. So you need things like basic financial legislation, financial market regulation, small business and medium-sized business enterprise development. So you can find areas of technical expertise that these countries are actually going to be pretty good at, and in some form of framework, either through the EU or directly with the countries to provide some of that expertise. Always, as you emphasized, led by the people in the region. Let them tell us what the priorities are, but I think that we can find ways to help in specific areas. There was a question about, well, what do you conclude about NATO? And I just want to say, if NATO, if you're the United States or other countries looking at a future operation somewhere, if it doesn't have the capabilities and half the countries don't have the public will to engage in expeditionary operations, why go to NATO? And I think that's the question the U.S. and others are going to be looking at in the future. My prescription, and I'm not unhappy with this, NATO could do well to focus on a broad concept of security in the transatlantic area. We're used to thinking about military, truly build in whole-of-nation protection like protecting critical infrastructure, protecting energy supplies, protecting the internet access, cybersecurity, and increasingly areas of our society are going to be vulnerable, such as food supply, water supply, mass transit. And these are areas where I think coordination to really help share information and provide security might be fruitful for NATO, and they would have public support in European countries because it is about what's closer to home. And the expeditionary things, we may have to look for more limited and other frameworks.
Investor, you had a comment?
Yes, actually, on both points. First, was there a functional erosion of NATO? Also the same question. I would say, very quickly, if we look at NATO today, it has major three operations. Afghanistan, where US is leading. In Kosovo, it is Germany leading. In Libya, the French and the British took the lead. So it depends on operation. They are not all the same, and one size doesn't fit all. So, and one nation cannot find all the solutions. It's important that in the overall, in aggregate, whether the capabilities are provided by chipping in of different countries. So therefore, I think Libya shown the resilience and vitality and pertinence of NATO actually, as it was stated. On the what can the region offer to North Africa and the transitions and transformations on the Mediterranean basin. Indeed, for example, Nordic Baltic or Baltic cooperation is one of the most successful ones in terms of, for example, security, defense, and defense production, defense-related cooperation within the alliance, and perhaps also within EU. It is quite successful, and it is cited always as a positive example, and therefore they can first set a precedent for regional cooperation. Secondly, of course, many allies who had recently undergone transformations, in particular in defense field, defense sector reform, security sector reform. These experiences can also be shared with countries who will be undergoing processes of transformation.
Thank you. Up here now?
Yeah. Konstantin Agats from Moscow. I have two questions. One to both slightly ironic, but slightly provocative, I hope. One to Kurt. Could we say now that at least parts of the previous administration's strategy and policy in the Middle East were actually vindicated in the last year during the Arab Spring? And second question, I don't know who to address it to, but probably to Fraser first. With the new Arab governments and Arab masses now coming back to, trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian question, in a sense, sort of like forcing Israel to do what it doesn't want to do. Do you think that it's going to be a bit more difficult to, for the Europeans and for the Americans to deal with the situation now that you have Arab governments that have legitimacy demanding from the West to do something about Israel, and with the American administration not being particularly interested in foreign policy, and the Europeans broadly agreeing with the goal, and the Turks actually egging their masses on, isn't it a recipe for a crisis? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to kick that one off? Kurt?
Well, I'm happy to dive in on the first part of the question there. I don't think it's good to be sort of triumphalist and vindicating and say, oh, we got everything right. In fact, there are many things that we got wrong in the last administration, too. But let me point out a few things. In November of 2003, President Bush gave two speeches, one at the National Endowment for Democracy, one at the Royal Banqueting House in London. Essentially the same speech, but for a slightly domestic versus international audience. The basic point of which was to say we had gotten 60 years of politics in the Middle East wrong. Same point that you and others here on the panel were making today. Basically saying that we had traded freedom in the name of stability and got neither. And the only way to get lasting stability is through freedom. This then led to the 2004 Sea Island Summit of the G8, where the focal point was on the broader Middle East and North Africa and how to build cooperation with civil society in the broader Middle East. This was then supported with a variety of programs. The Middle East Partnership Initiative is one of them. The Forum for the Future was launched, which was an annual meeting of members of the G8 with countries from around the region with civil society groups. First one, I believe, was held in Morocco, if I remember right, and we had a handful of civil society groups. By the time it was held a year later in Jordan, we had about 200. So there was an explosion in response to this. We formed a few other initiatives in partnership with Turkey and Italy in terms of working directly with NGOs, so the U.S. government out of it, and U.S. NGOs with those NGOs. This then continued on for several years. I take your point about the Palestinian elections, and I guess a question that comes up is where do we draw the line on groups that use violence and do not support a repetitive democratic process? And that's a question, it's a serious question, and I'm not trying to just put the finger on Hamas, but even in any of these transitions, people have to be willing to play by democratic rules, both in terms of nonviolence and in terms of process. And so how do you deal with groups like that when you do want to be inclusive of everyone? But I do think that there's a lot that was said and done in the early days, and President Obama picked up on this in his Cairo speech as well. I would say there was continuity here through 2009 on that. What we didn't have was the genuine belief that this is transformational and that it means reorienting some of the other things we're doing, such as our security relationships and our backing of these regimes, presence of our military establishments. I think that is now where we need to go. We really need to rethink.
You want to make a comment?
Yes, I mean, on the question of whether or not there is credibility, I guess, to the groups, whether they believe in the principles of democracy. In Hamas's case, and I assume in the case of most Palestinians, I guess they felt hard done by. First and foremost, regardless of who is governing the Palestinian territories, there is another government above them who fundamentally encroach upon every right that we could probably imagine possible for a human to have in this room. So we must take that into consideration. The aid, which is now vital towards the lives of Palestinians every day, has been taken away, or was taken away, in again, another move which took at the expense of fundamental necessities for humans to live and to try and forward their lives, was taken away in a political move against Hamas. So I mean, yes, I think there are definitely some moves that need to be taken by groups such as Hamas. They need to be able to provide the very, very basic element, and this is even for the Arab Spring, a constitution, a vision for the future, an acceptance that if things don't go right for them in the ballot box in the next round, that they would leave. However, if we don't level out the playing field for groups like Hamas, then how do we expect them to play? Okay. So I mean, that's my general response.
I mean, I raised the question in Cairo a couple of weeks ago, talking to a range of people. America, sadly, has lost huge amount of credibility, but including Obama, unfortunately. There was a lot of hope for Obama. And now they see that he basically has been unable to move on Israel. Settlements have keep expanding. America is unwilling for various reasons to put any pressure on Israel. And so there's a great deal of disappointment with the administration. Plus the fact that you had the unholy alliance between the US and Mubarak basically isolating Israel and protecting it from the genuine feelings of most Egyptians. And now you've seen what's happened in the last couple of weeks. The street has come out and said, we want to change things. Nobody's defending the attack on the Israeli embassy, but there's a fundamental desire for a change in Egyptians' attitude towards Israel, which other countries like, you've seen Erdogan in Egypt the last couple of days picking up on. So the whole stakes in the Middle East have changed quite fundamentally. And it's, I think, largely because of the erroneous policy of the United States over many years in the Middle East. Because, as Kurt said, there's been a couple of nice speeches, but that's all. So fundamentally, everyone looks to America for democracy. When it comes to the crunch and the street and the Arab world, they say hypocrisy, double standards. And I think somehow that balance has to be brought back into play.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to start taking 2 questions at a time. One back here.
Yeah, Jia Qingguo from China. Actually, I have 2 questions. The first question deals with, you know, the capacity of our ability to intervene. Okay? How much are we overestimating our capacity to intervene? Actually, on my way here, it's a long flight. I was reading George Bush Jr.'s memoir. He was talking about his decision to intervene, to have the Afghanistan war. That war probably is the most likely to be success, right? The US was at the height of its power, and the US has, because of 9/11, has all the international support he could get. And of course, Afghanistan is a very weak state. So, there was a lot of promise that this kind of intervention would change, would be successful. But what has happened? Okay. Now the West, especially the United States, is rather weak economically. What can we do about a big country like Syria? The second question is, are we making things worse by promising too much? Okay. So when we promise to intervene, we raise the expectations of the people of those countries. And then they raise larger demands, and then exacerbate tension between the government and the people, okay? Making political compromise less likely and military suppression more likely. So are we contributing to a worse case, to worse kind of scenario than making things better? This is these 2 questions, I would like to hear your response. Thank you.
Thank you. Down here.
Hi, Yaşar, College member of the Latvian Parliament. We've been focusing on Western commitment to this region, but there are some other global players who have an interest in this region. Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey is now traveling through the region and could be emerging as a leader. Iran has its interests and motivations, and we can go as far as Russia and China also, who have been involved in these countries before and clearly are interested in being a part of future development. And my question is, will Europe be cooperating or competing with these other countries in further commitments in this region?
Okay, who wants to start on that one?
Let's make some similarities with the Baltic Nordic region 20 years ago. There was a question from the audience and there was an answer, and that's a very well-functioning democratic region. So it wasn't so 20 years ago. And when you look why, the regional support helped a lot. We were looking at Scandinavian countries as a roadmap, where to go, the road model, what to achieve, and these countries were assisting a lot. So, and we look at this Northern Africa case, I would say Turkey must play important role because it's a regional player. And as well as the southern part of Europe, like Italy, France, and Spain, must play an important role. Because otherwise, if you stay away from these processes and leave it only for Arab League, and so for the locals, which is also important, if you remember, we had in the Baltic Assembly. So we really have to combine the differences of each states, which are really very important, the regional organization like Arab League, plus regional players, and Turkey is a big player, and it has to play much, much bigger role in these processes. That's my opinion.
Fraser?
I think, Chinese colleagues, we want to have a real debate now about what responsibility to protect really means. I mean, China actually signed up for this when it was debated at the UN some time ago, and I think the UN Security Council is the right place to focus on this. And there's a number of principles which, if they're followed through in terms of capabilities, expectations, likelihood of result, they're actually very good. And I think it worked pretty well in the case of Libya. So I think engaging the international community on a regular basis on what this means is a very useful exercise. Secondly, I think Afghanistan was a huge mistake. Not only because of the history, the wrong war at the wrong time, but because we never brought our public opinion along with us. And if you don't have the public opinion with us, that degrades support for the alliance as a whole. And I think that's a genuine problem all our politicians are still facing with today. And the question about can other countries help? Yes, I mean China's doing it right now. China, I think, is wanting to get back into Libya. They had 30,000 people there and got them out in about 3 or 4 days, which was an amazing feat. But they have interests there. Russia has interests there. There'll be some competition inevitably, but in terms of building up infrastructure, providing loans, doing some of the training, there's room for everyone here. This is not just a task for the EU or the United States.
Whoa, now they fixed it. Have we created kind of excessive expectations for what NATO and the West can do? Yeah.
Well, I don't think for the Middle East, as I said, for the North Africa and Middle East and the transformations we see there, I don't think whatever NATO has done or Europe and the West has done, I don't think it has unduly has risen expectations. I think there was clear mandate, and there were clear statements on how much, for example, on the part of NATO, it would be involved and where it should stop and where it would follow a supportive role and contribute to the overall general broader international efforts. So I think NATO has been clear on that throughout. On the other issue, whether, I cannot speak on behalf of countries, but in case of, for example, Turkey, Italy, and other countries also their policies to the region, there may be differences, nuances, because it cannot be expected to be identical. But I think overall they are in the same line that is supporting the democratic aspirations within NATO, and I don't think they are alternative to one another, but supporting one another, I would say.
Okay. Anybody else? Kurt?
Happy to comment.
Short?
I'll try to keep it short. First off, in terms of capacity to intervene, I think we have tremendous capacity to intervene. Where we failed is to produce stable societies in the wake of that. I think Libya is going to come out well. I think that Iraq has a better government now than it did under Saddam Hussein, but look what it took to get there. And it's on a track to improve, and Afghanistan is still very, very dicey. On the issue of raising expectations, it's a very good question. And I spent a lot of time in Hungary, and I know the way they feel about 1956. So there is a question about raising expectations. But I would address the point this way. First off, values are indeed universal, that people believe in core human values. As democratic societies and market economies and people believe in human rights and rule of law, we need to stand on their side. Doesn't mean always intervene. That's not necessarily the solution in every case. But we've got to be clear about where we stand. And that means being honest about what we actually see. I remember a few months ago the phrases coming out, and when the world was thinking we should call for Assad to go, we're saying, well, he might be a reformer. Not telling the truth about things leads to bad policy. So I think we got to be honest about things, clear on our values, and stand up for that. And then, as I said, you can't believe that there's a conflict between your values and your long-term interests. The real question is figuring out how you get there.
Thank you.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I think it's very difficult to win a war when you can't determine who your enemy is in Afghanistan. It's not about who you are and how much energy you have, but a war on terror, an old-style war with an old way of thinking, really hasn't brought fruit in the way that people in that region want it to. So I mean that would be my first response to, in order to say that, again, what my colleague has said now in terms of raising the bar or looking at values in a universal way, I completely agree. And that's not something that would call an expectation, but really a demand, because people in the Arab world, the Muslim world, people outside of the West now are not going to expect it, but will demand it. And in the way that Libya has shown, will most likely get there. Determining the level of violence is probably what it takes. On the question of competing or cooperating, I think it's mainly going to look like in Libya a reconfiguration. There were certain countries that were perhaps favored under Gaddafi for political, ideological, philosophical reasons, trying to assess the mind of Gaddafi is anyone's bet here, but I don't think it's a worldwide endeavor. But for various reasons, perhaps some countries were favored. If those countries had a lesser part to play, in the words of Mahmoud Jibril, who the now appointed Prime Minister, he said they were protecting their interests and we will protect ours. And that's something that I think will largely determine and shape the future of economic relations from Libya with the rest of the Western world.
Okay, last two questions, very brief and brief answers. Over here first.
Mary Dejevsky from the British newspaper The Independent. You talked at the beginning about lessons learned from the Libyan operation, and people talked about what could be learnt from NATO, the NATO operation, whether it was an alliance operation or a military operation. But there's another half of this, which is how Libya ends up afterwards. I think Mr. Volker just referred to this, but are you convinced or optimistic that the configuration that we're seeing now is pretty much the shape of the future in Libya?
Okay. Over here.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question regarding Syria, but I need to also make a short comment.
No,
no,
just a question. We don't have time for comments.
Okay. The question was regarding Syria and the apparent Russian objection to having a UN Security Council resolution. Can anybody in the panel tell me what is behind the Russian objection? Is it a strategic interest in Syria, or is it a more general policy issue that they have with regard to the responsibility to protect and NATO's future global role?
Okay. Who's going to take the Russia one? Fraser?
I mean, I think the Russians do have a genuine objection to responsibility to protect. I think there was particular circumstances that led to the abstention for Libya, pressure put on by allies, and they didn't want to be squeezed into a corner, especially when the Chinese were going to come on board with the US, UK, and France. The Russians are really worried about genuine expressions of popular opinion. Think back to the Orange Revolution, think back to Georgia, even in Central Asia. Whenever there's a genuine outburst of popular opinion, Moscow doesn't know how to react. And the instinctive reaction is we must stop it. So they're scared of the street in Moscow. And I think there's a few friends in the Baltic region who would probably agree with that. And this is, this is a part of the, it's old thinking. They have a sham democracy. You'll see it again, in a few months' time. And they can't really get beyond the old Stalin dictum, which I would remind people if you don't recall it, it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the vote that counts. And I'm afraid that's still the case in Russia.
Okay. And the other question? Here.
Yes, the question posed on Libya. In terms of my own work, I've just written an article on post-conflict security and the challenges that Libya will face for the Sadig Institute, which is a first policy institute in Libya. I think revolutions can be quite messy, and we shouldn't expect everything to go down the road of a dream, perhaps. At the same time, the future, we have to assess the kind of challenges. I mean, first and foremost, there is thousands and thousands of arms laying down in the streets in Libya. However, and this is a crazy occurrence, that we can live in the 21st century in a capital city somewhere in the world without a functioning state or government, and for there to be no state of panic and no serious threat to security. So I mean, looking forward, there are obviously going to be problems, as the popular, I think it's the Greek maxim goes, that absolute power corrupts. I think we must also be wary that absolute powerlessness equally corrupts. And that's something that could also be a problem for those that have been on the fringes of power for 42 years. There is equally the possibility for it to go wrong. Gaddafi didn't spring up on his own. He did not come from a foreign planet. He came from my country, Libya. And there are plenty more people that could take his role. So, I mean, we have to be very, very careful. But I think this is an opportunity to strengthen institutions. And really, like I said earlier on, to reiterate, to strengthen the role between civil societies, to try and create that thick layer between the governor and the governed, which didn't exist beforehand, in order that we can safeguard our democratic aspirations for the future of Libya.
President Zatlers, any final comments?
No. My neighbor's comment was the best about that topic.
Okay. Ambassador?
Well, indeed, on Libya, whether what's today appearing is the final shape of things, I don't think today we have a clear picture. Therefore, it's very difficult to predict the final shape, and that's what I would go say.
I would agree with my Libyan colleague here. Democratic progress is not a straight line, and it's also better than all the alternatives.
Okay, please join me in thanking our panel. Terrific session. We're now going to the reception. There are these terrific volunteers that Lado has put together that will help you find the place. We've also have a wonderful group of young diplomats and others that are watching this, these sessions. And there is a session that's going to happen right after this, so that they should hang on and enjoy yourself at the reception and dinner, and then get ready for the Night Owl sessions tonight, which will really be terrific. So again, thank you.